As I said, the Dansalan Declaration, there are two, no? 1934 and 1935. The Dansalan Declaration is rarely mentioned in mainstream history, Philippine history.
Yes.
And then it was very religious in tone, no? Kasi people of Islam, saying people of Islam. Moroland would have ended up like Hawaii, losing its ancestral lands to plantations owned and run by white Americans. Bigyan na natin sa mga Pilipino independence if that's what they want, pero hindi natin include ang Mindanao at saka Sulu. So, the Moros were divided on this issue. There were those who were against the Filipinos, there were those against the Americans, and there were those against both. The Dansalan Declaration actually articulated the basic sentiments of the Moro people. Although, sasabi natin na nandun yung very, very pro-American nila because they believe at that time we have to learn from history. We have to let our people know their history. Because by knowing your history, profound knowledge of our history, then we can appreciate why we are Bangsamoro. How we treat our identity is very tenuous. Superficial. Kasi hindi natin alam ang history. Tinawag ng, okay, Moro ka, pero what?
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to the commemoration and conversation, the Bangsamoro History Month 2026 special. When we celebrate Bangsamoro history or History Month, we always think about what's been written in books, what's been in the conversation, but rarely we do recognize that there are people, there are experiences, there are pivotal moments that part of those conversations. Today, we are very honored to be na pinagbigyan tayo ng isa sa mga pinaka-respetado, isa sa tinuturin kong living historians ng Bangsamoro, isa sa mga naka-experience ng pivotal key moments ng Bangsamoro, including yung negotiation during ng pag-drop ng FAB, ng CAB. He's even part of the BTC. But we know him as someone na very strong advocate ng Bangsamoro culture and heritage. So, ngayong umaga ay makakasama po natin ang aming commissioner ng Lanao del Sur. Walang iba kundi si Commissioner Robert Alonto. Assalamualaikum po, Commissioner.
Waalaikum salam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Sister Snaira, for inviting me to this event today.
Yes pa. So, one of the key milestone or key event na nangyari kaya naging Bangsamoro History Month po ang March ay ang ating Dansalan Declaration. So marami po sa ating mga tagapanood ay hindi ganon kapamilyar or especially itong mga kabataan natin kasi when we talk about March 18, ang unang papasok sa isipan natin is yung Jabidah Massacre, which is coincidentally is also yung Dansalan Declaration. So can you first talk to us about what you know about Dansalan Declaration?
Yeah, first of all, the Dansalan Declaration, there are two Dansalan Declarations, by the way, 1934 and 1935. Okay? Now, the Dansalan Declaration is rarely mentioned in mainstream history, Philippine history.
Yes.
The most is that nami-mention siya as footnote, but rarely mentioned siya. So, the knowledge of the Dansalan Declaration is very, very meager. Okay? You really have to research. But I was able to know about the Dansalan Declaration, of course, through my parents, my grandparents. They were very much aware of that. And the books that I read, yung kay Dean Mahul, Cesar Adib Mahul, and then yung Keep It Going, and other books. But insofar as mainstream Philippine history is concerned, very rare, the Dansalan Declaration. I think they did not want to speak about it.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So ano po yung Dansalan Declaration para sa ating mga tagapanood? Ano ang meron sa Dansalan Declaration and why it is important na we always revisit it every Bangsamoro History Month?
Okay, as I said, the Dansalan Declaration, there are two, no? 1934 and 1935. If you don't mind, I'll give you the context.
Sure.
Para maintindihan ng mga ano natin. So, when Spain lost the Spanish-American War in 1898, it ceded colonies. Cuba, its colonies like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam to the United States of America, and sold the Philippines to the latter for 20 million Mexican dollars in December 10, 1898,
Yes.
in the Treaty of Paris. Now, the U.S. formally took over the Philippines as a colony following U.S. President William McKinley's announcement of his adherence to the imperialist and racist doctrines called Manifest Destiny. I think you're aware of this. And a variant called White Man's Burden. Okay. Subsequently, a military government was established in the Philippines on August 14, 1898. Now, in March 1901, the so-called Philippine insurrection was virtually terminated with the capture of Emilio Aguinaldo, the leader of the ill-fated Malolos Republic by the Americans. Consequently, American colonialist attention shifted in earnest to Moroland after the pagka-capture ni Aguinaldo. The U.S. established a succession of military governments, which were later called the Moro Province in 1903, that lumped together 5 Moro-dominated regions. But before the Moro Province was created, the Battle of Bayang, popularly known among the Moro people as Padang Karbala, took place on May 1, 1902, between the Moro Maranos of Lanao and American forces. And this inaugurated the Moro-U.S. War and the bloody U.S. pacification campaign from 1902 to 1913, later led by General John Blackjack Pershing. Now, Padang Karbala, the Battle of Bayang was in 1902. Budahaw was in 1906. Okay. By 1904, then U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had unilaterally abrogated the 1890 Kiram-Bates Treaty. Okay? The abrogation of the treaty set the stage for the U.S. military occupation and colonization of Moroland in earnest, but did not end, but rather intensified Moro resistance to U.S. colonial rule. Now, across the ocean also in 1902, the U.S. granted independence to Cuba. Very, very significant ito. The grant of independence to Cuba had emboldened the Filipino nationalists or Filipinistas, as they called themselves, to lobby for Philippine independence, both in the U.S. and in the Philippines. Consequently, the Philippine Bill of 1902 committed the U.S. to Philippine independence, and the Jones Law of 1916 that limited autonomy, but not as immediate as the grant of independence to Cuba. And so, because of pressures from the Anti-Imperialist League in the U.S., whose members were former U.S. President Grover Cleveland and Mark Twain, ito yung mga intellectuals nila, no? They were against yung acquisition of colonies by the United States. Si Roosevelt, which succeeded McKinley's presidency in 1935, programmed Philippine self-rule in incremental stages, resulting eventually in the grant of political authority to the Filipinos through the Tidings-McDuffie Law of 1934 in the form of the Commonwealth of the Philippines that was established in November 1935. Now, the Tidings-McDuffie Law also set the schedule of Philippine independence after 10 years from the establishment of the Commonwealth, which means in 1945, supposedly in 1945, but this was kasi nagkaroon ng gera, World War II, sa intervening. Now, here, I'd like to mention there are 5 factions or schools of thought among American officialdom and the public. Okay? So, para maintindihan natin to. O 4 schools of thought. Number one school of thought is that yung mga Amerikano na nag-adhere to the McKinley Doctrine of Manifest Destiny and the European white man's burden. Sa kanila, white man's manifest destiny, ang belief ni McKinley is that it is the duty of the Americans to spread democracy and civilize.
Until now.
Until
Meron
now.
pa rin
Yan ang
ganyan.
kanilang ano. And then, Europe, sila Kipling also, si Kipling wrote a book about the white man's burden. Ang sabi ni Kipling, it is the burden of the white man. Racist ito na to raise the colored people, yung mga hindi whites, under the tutelage of the white man. So, kikita mo, racist, no? So, those who adhere to this McKinley Doctrine of Manifest Destiny and white man's burden believe that the Philippines should remain as an unincorporated territory or colony of the U.S. like Puerto Rico, Guam, and Northern Marianas. Okay. The second faction or the second school of thought is that the anti-imperialist league of the U.S. that believe that holding colonies violated the spirit and letter of the U.S. Constitution. Ito yung mga anti-imperial, ayaw nila ng colonies. Kasi sabi nila, well, this violated yung U.S. Constitution, etc., etc., etc. Now, the third school of thought, those who believe that the Philippines should be granted independence, but gradually or incrementally, and only after the Filipinos learned self-governance and American democracy. Ito yung prevailing school of thought. But there is another fourth school of thought. There are those, this is a fourth school of thought, believe that they took the position that the Philippines be granted independence after a transition period, but Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan should not be included in this grant of Philippine independence, but ought to remain under U.S. rule and converting it into a huge plantation colony like Hawaii. The scheme actually originated from U.S. Colonel Ralph Hoyt, who became the transition Governor General before Tasker Bliss, who became acting governor of the Moro Province in 1909. Okay? So, these are the four. So, doon nagre-revolve yung dynamics dito sa apat na schools of thought na ito. Dito insofar as the Philippines is concerned and Mindanao and Sulu were concerned. Okay? So, to continue, okay. With the establishment of the Commonwealth, the position of American Governor General was abolished and changed to High Commissioner. The last U.S. Governor General was Frank Murphy, with the title of Governor General out. In other words, High Commissioner na si Murphy. Hindi na siya Governor General. But Murphy then became the first U.S. High Commissioner of the Philippines. It was to him that the Dansalan Declaration of 1935 was submitted to Frank Murphy. Okay? The Filipino nationalists, however, led by Manuel L. Quezon, who headed the Philippine Assembly and became the president of the Philippine Commonwealth, not only wanted to immediately have an independent Philippines that was not only confined to Hispanic Philippines or Las Islas de Filipinas, that was the name of the Hispanic Philippines, Luzon and Visayas, which consisted of Luzon and the Visayas, but also the inclusion of what the Spaniards earlier referred to as La Tierra del Moro, or Land of the Moro, which the Americans, when they took over from Spain, literally adopted and translated to English as Moroland. Hence, Moro Province. Okay, so, andun yung flow. In retrospect, it was Quezon in his second State of the Nation address on June 16, 1936, as President of the Philippine Commonwealth, who called for the expeditious colonization of Mindanao and Sulu. Because sabi niya nga nun, kung di natin i-colonize ang Mindanao and Sulu, other foreign powers might colonize it. No? Okay, so yun ang kanyang argument. No? It was then that Filipino Christian settler migration to Mindanao from Luzon and Visayas had been rapidly accelerated pursuant to this Filipino colonization scheme. Backpedaling to the years before that, there was another influential lobby group in the Philippines, kaya sinabi ko, who took a contrary view. For while they were not explicitly opposed to the grant of political autonomy and independence of the Philippines, they were against the inclusion of Mindanao and Sulu to what was then being envisioned as an independent Philippines. Why? Why were they opposed to the inclusion of Mindanao and Sulu, these Americans? Not because this group of influential Americans loved the Moro people, but because they wanted Mindanao and Sulu to remain under U.S. sovereignty and thus an American colony so they could transform Moroland into a huge plantation for rubber, sugar, pineapple, and coconut, like what they did to Hawaii in 1898 and 1900. It is of interest to note that Sanford A. Dole, this is just pahabol, si Sanford Dole he was the one who led the American overthrow of the sovereign indigenous Polynesian Hawaiian monarchy and was appointed thereafter as the U.S. governor of Hawaii. And you know who Dole is. His family owned the Dole Pineapple Company. And needless to say, Hawaii, which is now the 50th state of the United States, is famous for the pineapple plantations like Dole and Del Monte. Yun ang gusto nilang gawin sa Mindanao. Okay? Kaya ayaw nilang isali ang Mindanao sa independence ng Philippines. No?
So, economic ang...
Economic, yes. Ganun ang kanilang ano. So, so the point is, had this lobby group succeeded in retaining Mindanao and Sulu as an American colony, Moroland would have ended up like Hawaii, losing its ancestral lands to plantations owned and run by white Americans. Or worse, like Puerto Rico, an unincorporated U.S. territory which until now remains uncertain of its status since 1898. Puerto Rico is a part of the United States pero hindi siya incorporated. It is not a state. So alanganin, kaya mga Puerto Ricans gusto nila maging independent na from the United States. Kasi alanganin ng kanilang status until now. Imagine, kasabayan ng Philippines nung kinuha ng mga Amerikano in 1898. Also Guam, no? Still unincorporated territory, no? In any case, the prominent leader of this group that was organized, that was against Moro-Sulu inclusion, was U.S. Senator Robert L. Bacon of New York, who passed a bill not to include Mindanao and Sulu to the Philippines, which was the Bacon Bill of 1926. A staunch supporter of Senator Bacon was U.S. Governor General Leonard Wood, the Governor General of the Philippines. Siya ang staunch supporter ni Bacon. Gusto nila, bigyan ng independence, sige, bigyan na natin sa mga Pilipino independence if that's what they want, pero hindi natin include ang Mindanao at saka Sulu. Okay? Who had the same passion, si Leonard had the same passion for turning Mindanao and Sulu into an investment for U.S. businessmen. In other words, a plantation colony. Okay? But this bill did not prosper because in the U.S. Congress, because of the combined pressures from the Anti-Imperialist League of America and the Philippines and the Filipinistas, led by Quezon and Sergio Osmeña Jr., who lobbied against it in Washington, D.C. Also, when Leonard Wood died in 1927, hindi na nag-prosper itong Bacon Bill. So, in the middle of this brouhaha, no, itong dynamics na ito, this is where pumasok yung issue ng Mindanao at saka Sulu. Okay, in the middle of this brouhaha, and among the Filipinos and the Americans were the Moros themselves. So, the Moros were divided on this issue. There were those who were against the Filipinos, There were those against the Americans, and there were those against both. Okay? But by and large, even without external prodding, the Moros in that era detested the Filipinos for their pro-Spanish role in the 333-year war between the Moros and the Spaniards, as well as for religious reasons, and thus vehemently opposed the inclusion of Moroland to the envisaged grant of political autonomy, let alone independence to the Filipinos. Behind the scenes, the group of Senator Bacon, undeterred by the failure of the Bacon Bill, capitalized on and exploited the prevailing sentiment of the Moros, who were devotedly opposed to inclusion. Some historical sources even say the Americans bankrolled, itong grupo ng mga Amerikanong ito, bankrolled some of the Moro activities that opposed Mindanao Sulu inclusion into the Philippine state. Whatever the case may be, if the Americans indeed attempted to use the Moros for their own vested interests, the Moros in turn took advantage of this to freely ventilate their own grievances with little or no repressive reaction on the part of the American and Filipino colonial authorities. Naggamitan sila. No? Sige, ano kayo? Kasi si Leonard Wood, si Governor General at the time, so in-encourage nila itong mga Moro, sige, you ask for separation. No? Kasi vested interest nila yan eh. No?
Yes.
Oo, so ganun. So, there were two Dansalan declarations, as I was saying. One in 1934 and the other in 1935. The 1934 document, however, was a letter petition, which was ignored by Frank Murphy, then the Governor General, who replaced Leonard Wood. Then still U.S. Governor General and the Filipinos. It failed to even get a reading, yung letter na yon, dun sa 1934 Constitutional Convention. Hindi na lang nila binasa yung letter na yon. But the same letter petition was converted into a declaration, which is now the Dansalan Declaration of March 18, 1935, that was signed by its leading advocate, Haji Abdul Hamid Bogabong of Unayan, who authored the 1934 petition and 199 Lanao datos. The historic signing ceremony was held at the Dayawan Turugan in Tuca, which is now in Marawi City. So that's the Dansalan Declaration all about. Okay. Now, yung first letter na ni Dato Bugabong, which became eventually the Dansalan Declaration of 1935, was confined to the Maranaos. It spoke about, and then it was very religious in tone. No? Kasi people of Islam, saying people of Islam. So there were three elements involved yan. Number one, they wanted protection of the religion, Islam,
Yes.
and their homeland, yung mga lands nila. Okay? Number two, ayaw nila sa mga Pilipino. But, if you read the letter, alagay doon, meron sila mga demands. If the demands rather, were met, then perhaps they would go for independence. May condition eh. Okay. But if not, then gusto nila, they would remain under American rule. That was the letter all about. So, again, one, it was all about protection of their religion, Islam, protection of their lands, and may mga conditions na they will only accept or go with yung independence kung ma-meet yung kanilang mga demands. If not, they would rather be with the Americans. In fact, ang tawag nila kay Kwan is Dato Americano. Tawag nila sa mga Amerikano, Dato Americano. So, makikita mo doon yung traces of mas gusto nila yung mga Amerikano kaysa sa mga Pilipino, which is of course justified din naman. As I was saying, kasi for 333 years of the Spanish-Moro Wars, yung mga Filipinos is nag-sided with the Spaniards. So, meron talagang sentiment, ganun. So, then sa 1935, in-expand yung 1934. Expanded na, hindi lang sa Lanao lang, but they were now talking of the people of Islam in Mindanao and Sulu. But the same pa rin, the same. Sabi nila, pag hindi na meet yung demand nila, then they would rather stay with the Americans, under American rule. Now, this is a stark contrast to the Zamboanga Declaration, because the Dansalan Declaration of 1934, the letter rather, and the Dansalan Declaration of 1935, they did not set the limit, yung time frame. Kasi gusto nila maging under sa Amerikano. So, kailan hanggang kailan? Unlike sa Zamboanga Declaration, and then of course, yung sa Dansalan Declaration was confined only to the Maranaos of Lanao, no? So, unlike sa Zamboanga Declaration, wherein you have the representatives of the 13 ethno-linguistic groups, the Muslim ethno-linguistic groups, the Moro ethno-linguistic groups, headed by Sultan Mangigin of Maguindanao, who told the Americans, we do not want to be under the Filipinos. Categorically. We would like to be under you, but after 50 years, grant us independence. And our nation should be called the Moro Nation. So may kita mo, merong, so may stark contrast, may difference. So ganon.
Sige po. Ang daming interesting sa inyong kwento. Unang-una na dun yung na-mention nyo na it did not start in 1935 pero a year prior with a letter that expanded into a declaration. You've also mentioned na this happened 1935, no? Years after yung Buddha Ho, years after yung Padang Karbala. Why do you think na even after Padang Karbala and Buddha Ho, our leaders back then still wanted na mas grabe yung hatred na maging under the Filipinos rather than under the American colony?
Okay. Remember that we were under the Americans for 50 years. Okay. We fought the Americans our forefathers fought the Americans for 50 years. But they fought the Filipinos and the Spaniards for 333 years. That's the difference.
So may association po ang Filipino sa Spaniards.
Meron. Yeah, because the Spaniards when they were here in the Philippines and they went to war against the Moros, actually hindi naman sila marami eh. According to data, there were only about 6,000 families Spaniards dito. But karamihan sa kanilang military forces, mga conscripts from the Indios, from the Filipinos. Natawag nila na time Indios, no? But of course, I don't want to call them because they are now our co-citizens. But the Indios or the Filipinos sided with the Spaniards. It was only in 1896 when they finally thought of fighting back or of regaining their independence from the Spaniards in 1896 when they organized in 1893 or 1892 di Katipunan. But it was only in 1896 that they fought the Spaniards. But because they were given the chance to organize the Katipunan in 1892 because of the Spanish operation against Amay Pakpak in Kuta Marawi in 1891 to 1895. So just imagine yung na-develop na hatred, na-develop na against the Filipinos at the time. So meron talagang inherent na-develop ng inherent hatred or inherent animosity. I don't want to use the word hatred, yung animosity against the Spaniards. And you cannot also blame them. Ganon. Because of that, yung 333 years, actually 321 years, but some say 333 years.
Yeah. Sige po. Regardless, it's been more than three centuries. Yes. You also mentioned yung four school of thought, no? Na-curious po ako, if naging successful yung Dansalan Declaration and we were granted what we wanted, what would be the alternate history na meron tayo sana? In your opinion?
Okay. We will be, siguro, what I foresee, if nag-succeed yun, para tayong Hawaii.
Hawaii.
we would be under the Americans, no? Mangyayari sa atin, we would be a plantation colony. Or like Puerto Rico, hindi naman siya regular state ng United States of America. Because Hawaii is already 58th state. But Puerto Rico is not a regular state. It is called the Associated Free State of the United States. Wherein Puerto Rico, hindi siya regular state. So, but ang kanyang, for all intents and purposes, ang kanyang status is still economy. And Guam, yun ang mangyari sa atin.
Would that be better? Or are we blessed na hindi natuloy yung...
No, I don't think that would be better because look at what happened to the Polynesians, the natives of Hawaii, the indigenous peoples of Hawaii. What happened to them? No? Wala na. Talagang integrated na sila, assimilated na sila. And now, they're trying to, meron na silang Hawaiian independence movement. Gusto na nilang i-reassert yung kanilang right to self-determination. No? And look what happened to what? The indigenous peoples of North America, the so-called Indians. No? Okay, ito yung nangyari sa kanila. So, they were confined to reservations. Ganun ang nangyari sa atin eh. Alam mo naman yung mga Amerikano, look at what they're doing now, no? Yes. Ngayon, merong variation yung manifest destiny at saka white man's burden, which is exceptionalism and unilateralism. And that's what they're trying to, what do you call that, operate on. What is exceptionalism? Exceptionalism means, ang tingin ng mga Amerikano, since they are a military power, the greatest power on earth, so exceptional nation sila. Wala silang kagaya.
Yeah.
Oo. So, because they are an exceptional nation, they can do what they want. That is unilateralism. Siguro, the most that can happen under American rule is hindi na ako Molana, pero Robert na ako. Ikaw, hindi ka na Isnaira, but what? Jane.
No, passively.
Mga ganun, ano? So, yan ang nangyari sa atin.
So in a way, nakabuti na we remain with the Philippine state. Ano po yung na-achieve ng Dansalan Declaration?
Okay. The Dansalan Declaration actually articulated the basic sentiments of the Moro people. Although, sasabi natin na nandun yung very, very pro-American ano nila. Because they believe at the time, sila Haji Bungabong, they believe that they would be in a more they would be in a safer situation, secure situation under the Americans rather than under the Filipinos. Yun ang kanilang, kasi because nga of that historical animosity that went on between the Filipinos and the Moros. Yeah. So, but kaya nga, yung sinasabi ko, I don't think that the longer that we were under American rule, it would be advantageous to us.
Anong importansya po ng Dansalan Declaration naman? And now that we have BARM, the Bangsamoro government, whenever we look back, we commemorate it every March 18. Anong important lesson ang binibigay ng Dansalan Declaration? And why do we always have to remember and revisit this historic moment?
Okay, after the Dansalan Declaration in 1935, which was ignored, sila Bungabong, Haji Bungabong, and the Lanao Datos rose in rebellion. This was the Kuta War, very bloody, 1936 to 1941. This is in history. Okay, very bloody war. It was a rebellion against the Commonwealth government and against the Americans. No? So it was a very bloody war. Sa akin lang is that ano ang lesson ng Dansalan Declaration? Ang lesson yan is that we have to learn from history. We have to learn from history. We have to let our people know their history. Because by knowing your history, profound knowledge of our history, then we can appreciate why we are Bangsamoro, our identity. And if we appreciate profoundly, no, that we are yung identity natin, the more that we would be motivated to preserve our cultural heritage. Without history, I don't think ang ating what you call that, yung ating identity, how we treat our identity is very tenuous. Superficial. Kasi hindi natin alam ang history. Tinawag lang, okay, Moro ka, pero what? No? So, very important sa atin na malaman natin yung ating kasaysayan. That's a very important itong History Month. So in order to inform our young people that, this is our history. And if they come to know yung kanilang history, yung attachment nila sa identity nila will be very, very profoundly strong. And because of that, yung cultural heritage, they will be able to defend and promote yung kanilang cultural heritage. So we have to know really our history. That's why very important ang role ng BCPCH. This is the role of BCPCH now. As the lead agency of the Bangsamoro government, dito sa promotion, sa writing of it's not just writing Bangsamoro history, but letting them know our Bangsamoro history. And yung promotion ng ating cultural heritage, we cannot promote our cultural heritage, preserve our cultural heritage, unless we can strengthen our people's knowledge of their history. What happened to us? We have to look back at history. So this is very important.